Hi everybody, welcome to another video lecture for Philosophy 1301B. Today the topic is Knowledge Sources Part 2. So before we get into it, why don't we just do a quick recap of Part 1 since it's been a while. So here we go. Remember, one of the running themes throughout this chapter, Chapter 5 of your course text, is what our author Helen Buss Mitchell is calling the egocentric predicament. And this is the idea that we can't really get out of our own limited ways of knowing the world. And this is tricky on the one hand because we want to know what the world is like, we want to know what reality is like, but also we want to know when our knowledge is certain and when it's not. In other words, we want to be able to know the difference between certain knowledge on the one hand and mere belief or opinion on the other hand. And the egocentric predicament really highlights both of those issues and the importance of doing epistemology for philosophers. So we started off by talking about Rene Descartes' rationalist approach. And if you remember, Descartes was all about applying this sort of methodological doubt or systematic skepticism. So Descartes doubted all of the knowledge that he thought was certain. He doubted knowledge from authority, he doubted knowledge from his senses, he doubted mathematical certainty, all of that stuff. And he arrived at this sort of foundation or bedrock, if you like, this epistemic foundation from which he could build up all of his knowledge and certainty again. And that's come to be known as the cogito. And that's of course short for cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And that captures what Descartes thought he could be absolutely certain about. That even if he was mistaken about everything or being deceived about reality by some kind of evil genius, he could nonetheless be certain that he, as a thinking thing, existed. So he begins to build his certainty back up, basically by appealing to the existence of an all-powerful, benevolent God who kind of guarantees his knowledge, his clear and distinct ideas. And he does this in a number of different ways. He offers an ontological argument for the existence of God, so that's a lot like St. Anselm's ontological argument, wherein God, being a perfect being, must necessarily exist. He points to Descartes further points to his innate idea of God. He claims he has an idea of God in his mind, and since he is a finite, imperfect being, he could not have conceived of an infinite, perfect being like God by himself. So he reasons that his idea of God must be innate. He further reasons that his ideas of God are clear and distinct, and he can rely on clear and distinct ideas. Clear and distinct ideas are trustworthy. And of course he also says that God, being benevolent, that is good, would guarantee his clear and distinct ideas. Of course this has come to be known as the Cartesian Circle. We discussed that quite a bit last time, where Descartes says one of the grounds for believing that God exists is his clear and distinct idea of God, and of course God is the guarantor of his clear and distinct ideas, so that's why Descartes can rely on his clear and distinct ideas. Of course, there's a bit of circular reasoning going on here. Basically, Descartes is begging the question. Both of these statements, God guarantees the trustworthiness and accuracy of my clear and distinct ideas, and I have a clear and distinct idea of God, therefore my idea of God is epistemically secure or reliable. Well, those both support one another, but there's no outside justification for either of them. So that's the Cartesian Circle. We also talked about substance dualism. Remember, Descartes says there are two kinds of substance, res extensa, or extended things, matter, and res cogitans, thinking things, the mind, thinking substance. And of course this led to the mind-body interaction problem. Namely, if the mind and the body are two different substances, res cogitans and res extensa, how do they interact with one another? And of course, Descartes thought that interaction took place in the pineal gland, the little gland in our brains. He specified where he thought this happened, but of course he does not explain how these two different substances come to interact with one another. So enter Baruch Spinoza, who, if you remember, was a pantheist, in other words, believed that God is everything, and he defined God as a single substance with infinite attributes. And we know two of these attributes. We know the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension, and we ourselves are finite modifications of these attributes of God. So our minds are finite modifications of the substance mind or thought, and our bodies are finite modifications of the substance or the attribute, the attributes of thought and extension. Our bodies are finite modifications of the attributes of extension, which means that there's only one substance, so we don't have this problem of two different substances interacting. And how do we explain two different substances and how they interact if one is physical and non-physical? Well, for Spinoza, there is no mind-body interaction problem because there's just one substance, and when we talk about minds and bodies, we're really just talking about two different attributes of the same substance. Leibniz had a kind of a similar view. He's also a substance monist, like Spinoza. So they're both different from Rene Descartes, who was a substance dualist. Leibniz believed everything was made of monads. And these monads don't really interact with one another. Rather, they all behave according to a pre-established harmony that was set forth by God, who is the monad of all monads. So our mind is a monad, our bodies are made of monads, but there's, again, like Spinoza, there's no interaction going on. It's all just pre-established harmony. So that means we don't have to contend with the mind-body interaction problem, because for Leibniz, there is no problem. So that's it for the rationalist thinkers that we covered. We also covered John Locke and George Berkeley, who were two empiricist thinkers. So the rationalists that I was just talking about, if you recall, believe that knowledge comes from the mind. It could be innate knowledge, or we can derive knowledge from innate principles, but knowledge is innate, the source of knowledge is the mind or thought for a rationalist. For empiricists, we get all our knowledge from sense experience. So John Locke did not believe in innate ideas like Rene Descartes did. In fact, he described the mind as a tabula rasa, or a blank tablet, a blank slate at birth, with nothing written on it. And it's experience that writes on our tablet that is the mind. So all knowledge comes from the senses. And Berkeley thought that, knowledge actually comes from, well, knowledge likewise comes from the senses, but that's not because there's a world, an actual real external world that exists out there. Rather, it all kind of exists in the mind of God, right? So where John Locke was a realist, what is really real is out there in the world. Berkeley was an idealist. What is really real is the mental. Of course, Berkeley did not arrive at this by looking at the world. He didn't come to form this belief by looking at the world. He did it by reasoning from certain principles that he already had in his mind. So that's a question we can ask about Berkeley, is whether he was really an empiricist or not. Maybe he was just a rationalist in empiricist's clothes. So anyway, so much for our review. Let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so the next thinker we're going to talk about is David Hume. Now, David Hume is arguably the most radical of the empiricists we're going to talk about. And like John Locke, David Hume denied the existence of innate ideas, and he thought that all knowledge came from sense experience. And this leads Hume to make a number of other claims. For example, denying innate ideas means he has to deny the innate idea of God. So Hume was an atheist. Hume also denies the existence of the self, at least in the sense that Descartes and other thinkers like him understood the self. And he also denies the existence of innate moral principles too. So Hume was actually what we would call a sentimentalist. rather than reasoning about right and wrong from innate ideas about right and wrong, Hume thought what we were actually doing was reasoning from our sort of gut reactions or our gut feelings about what's right and wrong. So that captures Hume nicely. An atheist denies innate ideas, denies the self. Hume was skeptical about a lot of things, and that's why he's a very radical empiricist. In any case, Hume differentiates between what he calls impressions on the one hand and ideas on the other hand. So what are impressions? Well, quote David Hume, all our sensations, passions, and emotions as they make their first appearance in the soul, end quote. Those are impressions. So impressions are strong and vivid. They're impressed upon the mind via the senses. So basically they're like our perceptions, or they are our perceptions. Hume contrasts impressions with ideas. So what are ideas? Well, Hume says, by ideas, I mean the faint images of these, i.e. impressions, in thinking and reasoning. So we get all of our ideas, that is to say all of our knowledge, from our impressions, that is to say the senses. And note here the difference between Hume and a thinker like Plato, for example. For Plato, the ideas, the forms, the eidos, right? Those are like the most real thing for Plato. The form of a triangle, the idea of a triangle, is more real than the triangles that exist in our reality, right? They all these triangles kind of participate in the ultimate form of triangleness, right? And the same goes for more abstract things like goodness, justice, beauty. There are forms of these things for Plato that are more real than the mere shadows on the wall of the cave that we perceive in our reality. But Hume says no, the ideas are much more faint. They're just things that are left or made by our sense impressions. Our sense impressions are stronger and more real. So for this reason, you know, this is another reason why Plato is often treated as a rationalist. You know, this is called Platonic rationalism, or Platonic realism. Excuse me. That the forms are real, and indeed more real than all of the things we see in our level of reality. Hume is not like that at all. Hume is also is almost like the opposite of that in his outlook about what ideas are. So we can build up complex ideas, according to Hume, or new ideas, ideas of things we've had no impressions of, by combining simpler ideas. So for example, this is something that gets talked about in modern philosophy quite a bit. I can have an idea of a winged horse, right? Of course, I've never seen a winged horse. Winged horses don't exist, but I can create the idea of a winged horse by combining simpler ideas, like that of a horse and that of a wing, or wings, a pair of wings. And of course, according to Hume, I've got those ideas from my impressions of horses on the one hand, and perhaps the wings of birds on the other hand. But, Hume says, if something first doesn't exist as an impression, it cannot exist as an idea. So, this led Hume to suppose that a lot of philosophers who were speaking about things like substance, that could be substance monists like Leibniz or Spinoza, or dualists like Descartes, who believed in extended substance and thinking substance. Well, Hume thought that these guys were just talking nonsense, because you could have no direct impressions of substance. And this is also why Hume was an atheist. He thought we could have no sense impressions of God, therefore no ideas or knowledge of God. And that's what led Hume to his atheism. And Hume even denies the mind or the self, at least the same kind of mind or self that Descartes had in mind, this thinking thing, this thinking substance, the cogito. In fact, Hume thought that the mind was merely a bundle of perceptions, a bundle of these impressions that he's talking about, together with the ideas that they create. There's no I, as in I am, I exist, as there was for Descartes. Hume would say that I, that ego, is an illusion. A lot like the Buddhist thinkers that we've covered in this class. In fact, Derek Parfit would call, the philosopher Derek Parfit would call Hume a bundle theorist. That is, that someone who believes that the self is really a bundle of ideas and impressions and things like that, rather than a continuously existing unified whole, the way Descartes would. Incidentally, Derek Parfit also calls the Buddha the first bundle theorist. So there's quite a bit of overlap between Buddhists thinking about the self and somebody like David Hume, which is interesting. Maybe something you'd like to explore in your essays. Anyway, if you're thinking of this if you're trying to place Hume in a category like those we've discussed in class, like when we spent time talking about human nature, we covered artichoke theory and avocado theory on the one hand. If there are any people watching this who don't know what I'm talking about, who aren't in my class and you want to know, let me know in the comments section. But basically Hume would have been, he would have taken the artichoke view. Humans are more like artichokes. No essential nature, just a bundle, rather than an avocado. It's a bit of a, I mean, it's an interesting way to put it. I've never really said this in class. I've always thought of this as kind of a funny way to capture these two different outlooks on, essentialism versus inessentialism about human nature. But nonetheless, it's simple, it works. Anyway, so David Hume saw metaphysics as somewhat of a blind alley, because philosophers were talking about things of which they could have no impressions of, and if ideas, knowledge comes from our impressions, then we can't have any knowledge about these things. But what about science's claims to knowledge? This is around the time when science was slowly diverging from philosophy. Back in the day, at the time of Descartes, science and philosophy were very much the same thing. And like who we would call a scientist today would have been called a natural philosopher back then. They would have just been a philosopher who studied nature rather than morality or God or something like that, right? So what about science's claims to knowledge? Well, science obviously looks at how things are in the world, how things interact with one another, what they're like, what these objects out there are like, and what their behaviors are like. So Hume had to examine three different ways that our ideas, which again come from impressions, which come from the world ultimately, are associated with one another. And he identified three different ways that our ideas come to be associated with one another. Resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. So, resemblance. That's pretty straightforward. Ideas of things, according to Hume, are related in the sense that they resemble one another. So, similar things resemble each other. That's what makes them similar to one another. So that's one way that ideas can be associated with one another. So, for example, my idea of, a raven is associated with my idea of a crow. Because of resemblance. I've got each of these ideas from my impressions of these creatures when I see them in the world, and in my mind they're associated with one another, perhaps because these ideas bear some resemblance to one another. So that's resemblance. That's pretty straightforward. There's also contiguity, and that is to say things that are close together in space and time. So objects that are physically close together, or perhaps events that have happened close together in time rather than far apart in time. So one example of contiguity might be my idea of my guitar here. My idea of my guitar is contiguous with my idea of my amplifier. I don't know if you can see it, but it's sitting right down here. Well, they're sitting right next to one another. So when I think of one, when I sort of bring the idea of one of them into my mind, the other might make its way into my mind as well, simply because they're sitting close to one another in space and time. So, in cases of resemblance and contiguity, these associations between ideas, as you may have guessed, are a result of the imagination. That is what we can picture in our minds, the mental imagery, right? The imagination. So these patterns of association are just that. They're mere patterns of association in our imagination. They're not necessary truths, like the kinds of truths we find in mathematics. So, no surprise, Hume goes on to say that the patterns of association that arise out of, or the patterns of association in the case of resemblance and contiguity, arise not out of logic or certainty, but out of feeling, sentiment, the imagination itself, so on and so forth. So when it comes to scientific knowledge, resemblance and contiguity are not going to be much hope, because these are all things that are that come to be in our minds, the ways that our mind puts certain ideas together, and the mind doesn't do this based on reason or rational principles. Or remember, Hume doesn't think we would have any innate ideas of such things. So, what about cause and effect? Well, science relies a lot on cause and effect. Science, one of the things science does is establish cause-effect relations or causal relations between natural phenomena. So, if we want to be certain about scientific knowledge, we better make sure that this relationship of cause and effect that we see in the world is a reliable one, that it's actually out there in the world. So that's where Hume turns next. But, according to Hume, cause and effect is also just a pattern of association. It's not something that exists out there in the world. So it's a bit like Leibniz, superficially. There's no cause and effect for Leibniz because there's a pre-established harmony of monads out in the world. For Hume, there's no cause and effect because it's just a pattern of association. So we associate events in the world in terms of cause and effect. But the idea of cause and effect, or the idea of causality, is just an idea in our minds. It's not something out in the world. It's in our minds. So, why was Hume reasoning like this? I mean, this seems like a very alien way to look at the world, a very strange way to look at the world. Cause and effect seem so obvious, don't they? When you look in the world and see things interacting with other things, it seems like cause and effect must be out there in the world. Well, here's why Hume thought that cause and effect exist in the mind and not in the world. For cause and effect to be out there in the world, Hume thought that three criteria must be met: contiguity, priority of time, and a necessary connection. So for contiguity, well, objects must be close enough together in the world. So think of a game of billiard balls, right? The cue stick strikes the cue ball, and it strikes the other balls, and we see each event as causing the next event, right? But in order to see it that way, well, the objects need to be close enough together. So no problem here. The objects are all on the pool table. They're close together. Priority of time, well, the cause must precede the effect. Again, if we think of our billiard ball example, no problem. The cue stick hitting the cue ball, well, the cue stick moves prior to the cue ball moving, which moves prior to hitting the other balls and breaking the balls. So the causes precede the effect. Again, no problem. But what about this idea of a necessary connection? Well, what that means is that effect A must follow from cause A. So an effect must necessarily follow from a cause, like logically necessary. Now, Hume granted that contiguity and priority of time were certainly met. We can have impressions of contiguity and priority of time. So we can have impressions about these things and therefore ideas about them. But it's this third thing, this idea of a necessary connection, that we cannot have an impression of and therefore an idea of. What we observe instead, rather than an actual necessary connection, we don't observe a logically necessary connection itself between causes and effects in the world. Rather, what we observe is merely a quote-unquote constant conjunction between two events, cause A and effect A. So we apply a pattern of perception, a pattern of cause and effect. It's just a way that our mind behaves, but it's not based on any impressions of anything that we're actually getting from the world. So we don't observe a necessary connection between cause and effect. We only observe the cause and the effect by applying a pattern of association. We don't observe this necessary connection, this logically necessary connection between causes and effects. Therefore, we can have no impressions of them, no ideas of them. Now, if Hume's right about this, well then, not just metaphysics is in trouble, but science is in trouble too. Science relies on there being causal relations in the world in order to explain the world. And this is how even modern scientists, rely on cause and effect. It's why we design different experimental conditions, and we control very precisely what goes on in these different conditions in a scientific experiment to try to get a better picture of what reality is like. Now, so if cause and effect is not out there in the world, and if science relies on cause and effect to make predictions and test hypotheses and form theories, well, science is in trouble. If cause and effect is just this psychological device that we have, then science loses a lot of its power to tell us about reality. So basically, if Hume is right, and that there is no cause and effect, it's not something that we can have impressions of and therefore have knowledge of, then we can't have certain knowledge about the world. So where do we go from here? Well, all of this has led us to something that has come to be known as Hume's fork. Hume's fork has two different tines on it. We'll see what those tines are right now. Now, okay, so Hume insisted that we cannot know anything. We can't have ideas about anything beyond what are formed via our impressions, right? So ideas are these sort of faint after images of our impressions. Our impressions are, they come from the senses. They're like our perceptions of the world. So we can only know based upon our impressions. Empiricism, in a nutshell. And this means that the area of inquiry that's legitimate is very, very small. There are, according to Hume, truths of reason, or logically necessary truths, and these would be things like those of mathematics, and those are great. We can have certainty about, that all triangles have three sides and that the internal angles of all triangles add up to 180 degrees. That's great. Those are truths of reason. They are logically necessary or mathematically certain. We can have certain knowledge there. Awesome. But those don't tell us anything about the world. So that's one tine of Hume's fork, these truths of reason or necessary truths. The other tine is what we could call matters of fact. That is, matters of fact about the world. This is the knowledge that we get from our sense impressions. They tell us what we want to know about the world, but they they're not reliable like mathematical certainties or logically necessary truths are. So they tell us what we want to know, but we can't have certain knowledge about them. So that's Hume's fork. Matters of fact, necessary truth on the one hand, matters of fact about the world on the one hand, and truths of reason or necessary truths on the other. One is certain but doesn't really tell us what we want to know. The other tells us what we want to know, but we can't have certain knowledge about those things. So what do? Well, neither of these are very appealing choices for philosophers, or indeed for scientists. And this needed to be dealt with. If Hume was right, philosophy and science would be over. So how did philosophy get beyond this? We're going to find out right now. All right, so after Hume, along came Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant wrote a very, very, very influential work in the course of his later life and career called The Critique of Pure Reason. In the critique, Kant tried to deal with some of the radical implications of David Hume's work. In fact, Kant said that reading Hume had awakened him from a quote-unquote dogmatic slumber, and he thought that Hume's philosophy, however radical, needed to be taken seriously. So Kant granted that knowledge comes from the senses. He agreed with the empiricists in this respect, but he didn't think that empiricism told the whole story when it came to the sources of our knowledge or how we can be certain about our knowledge. So, for Kant, the data or information, sense data has kind of come to be a problematic term in philosophy, but nonetheless, the sense data, for lack of a better term, that comes in to our senses, our sense experience, that forms the content of our knowledge. So I can have knowledge of or about certain things from my senses. That's what that means. But the form of our experience comes from these certain a priori concepts that already exist in the mind. So just to clarify, when something is a priori, we mean that it is deductive or independent of sense experience. That's contrasted with something that is a posteriori. That's something that's not deductive, but rather maybe inductive or abductive, knowledge that comes from experience. So a priori knowledge is independent of experience, a posteriori is not. And Kant thought that the form of our experience took shape as a result of a priori concepts in the mind. So this is to say that where we have a priori concepts, the content of our knowledge, rather than the form, is a posteriori knowledge. To try to hit this point home, Kant asks the reader to try and imagine objects not existing in space or time. Try it yourself. Think of any object in your mind. You're thinking of this object. Well, it's extended, in your mind at least. You have maybe an extended sort of thing in your mental imagery. Maybe you even think of things happening in a temporal sequence. If I imagine the earlier mentioned winged horse, if I close my eyes and imagine it, I imagine this winged horse running majestically through a field or flapping its wings or something. So events are happening over time and the object is extended. In fact, I don't think I can imagine an object not existing in space or time. And Kant argued that this exercise illustrates that we actually can't conceive of objects existing without space and time. And he argued that this means that space and time are not things out there in the world that we actually perceive. We don't perceive space and time themselves. Rather, space and time for Kant are a priori forms of sensible intuition or patterns of perception. So space and time is, for Kant, and this is a very radical idea, space and time are not out there in the world. They're in here. in the mind. Your textbook, to try to hit this point home, uses the example of an operating system of a computer. I'm not sure if that's a very good example. I tend to think of space and time for Kant as being more like the architecture of a computer, the physical and information architecture of a computer. So space and time, on that analogy, are a priori concepts that form part of the architecture of the mind. It's a pretty far out idea, especially if you're used to thinking of space and time as things that exist out there and not in here. But that's not the whole story. We have these forms of sensible intuition. Those are the fundamentals of the architecture of the mind for Kant. But we also have a priori concepts that he calls categories of understanding, or pure concepts of the understanding. So, under this category, Kant includes things like quantity, quality, relation, and modality. And we can make various judgments about each kind of category. And so, all this is to say that when information, or sense data, for lack of a better term, enters the mind, it is placed in space and time by the mind, because those are a priori concepts in the mind. Then, the information is perceived under one of these other categories of understanding, like quantity, quality, relation, and modality. If this didn't take place, if minds weren't like this, Kant thought, the world, our perceptual world, would be this meaningless jumble of raw, unprocessed data. William James described the perceptual world of human infants as a blooming, buzzing confusion. I think maybe for Kant, if we didn't have these categories of understanding, these forms of intuition, our world would be like a blooming, buzzing confusion. And if William James is right, and this is what an infant's world is like, perhaps that's because their minds have not yet secured, they've not yet settled on this architecture of forms of intuition like space and time and categories of understanding. Maybe those haven't developed yet. Although, on the other hand, Kant would say that these are innate, so I'm not sure how William James would feel about this. In any case, I just think that this phrase, blooming, buzzing confusion, might not just be appropriate for describing an infant's world. Maybe that's what our perceptual worlds would be like if the mind was not, or if the mind was not able to structure our perceptions in the ways that it does. In any case, now, recall that Kant thinks Hume is correct, that knowledge comes from sense experience, or from the senses. But Kant doesn't think that that's the whole story. Kant also thinks that knowledge claims also have to take into account these concepts and categories, all of this a priori stuff that structures our sense experience. But Hume, remember, also denied the existence of the mind or the self, at least in the Cartesian sense. Now, why did he deny this? Well, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. I am a continuously existing, unified, thinking thing. Hume doesn't think that's true. Hume thinks we're more like a bundle of perceptions and ideas. There is no I. This continuously existing, unified I is an illusion for Hume. And moreover, we can have no direct impressions of the mind. So we're not justified in making any knowledge claims about minds, because we can't have an idea of the mind, or a clear and distinct idea of the mind, like what Descartes was after, because we have no direct impressions of the mind. All the ways the mind seems to us is an illusion for Hume. But Kant responds to this by saying that, well, we can know the mind by examining how it shapes our experience. That's the way we can come to know the mind. Now, this means that when it comes to the mind, not just the mind, but a lot of other things, our knowledge is is still pretty restricted, according to Kant, but we can make more meaningful statements about, we can make meaningful statements rather about more things than Hume thought that we could by for example, understanding the way that minds structure our sense experience. For example, going back to the idea of causality and cause and effect, which was a big theme in Hume's work. Well, Kant includes the concept of causality under the category of understanding of relation. So how are things related to one another? One of the things they can be related, one of the ways they can be related is causally related. So A causes B, which causes C. The cue stick strikes the cue ball, which strikes the other ball, so on and so forth, right? So our sense experience is filtered through this category of understanding of causality. And we can, for Kant anyway, justifiably say that we know of cause and effect relations in the world because we know that the mind is structured in such a way that we can perceive cause and effect. So whereas Hume is saying there's no cause and effect because there's no logically necessary connection that we can have an impression of, Kant is saying, well, we don't need to have an impression of this necessary connection out there in the world because our mind is just structured to perceive the world in this way. And that, for Kant, makes his knowledge claims about causal relations more secure than Hume thought we could be about these kinds of relations. But as I mentioned, this means that the things we can know about the world on Kant's view are still limited in a pretty powerful way. So here Kant distinguishes between two ideas, two different things. Phenomena on the one hand, and noumena on the other hand. So what are phenomena and noumena? Well, I've mentioned these ideas in class before, but let's just reiterate them really quickly now before we finish up the lecture. Phenomena are things as they appear to us under the category of perception. And that's what phenomena means. It's like an appearance in the world. But for Kant, appearance in the world under the categories of perception. So how do objects or events or anything out there in the world that we get from sense experience appear to the perceiver in the mind when filtered through our forms of sensible intuition and our categories of understanding? So those are phenomena, appearances. Then on the other hand, there are noumena, things as they are in themselves beyond the limits of perception and knowledge. Kant thinks that we can know things as they appear to us. So we can know the phenomena, but we cannot know the noumena, the things in themselves. So that's how knowledge is limited. We've talked a lot about realism and idealism, what the world is really like and what's really real for a realist or an idealist. For a realist, what is really real is the world. That's the source of our knowledge. For an idealist, what is really real is the mental. And that's got to be the sources of our knowledge. But Kant is saying we can't really ever directly know what the world is really like. We can't know things in the world in themselves. We can only know how they appear to us. So yes, once again, knowledge comes from the senses, but that knowledge is structured by a priori concepts and categories in the mind. But in addition to this a priori and a posteriori distinction, Kant also makes an analytic-synthetic distinction. So what does he mean? Well, analytic propositions or analytic statements are statements about the world whose predicate concept is contained within the subject concept. So here we're talking about examples like all triangles have three sides, or all bachelors are unmarried, or all bodies are extended. Here, for example, the predicate concept, extended, is contained in the subject concept, bodies. That's an analytic proposition. A synthetic proposition is one where the predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept. So instead of all bachelors are unmarried, well, all bachelors are alone, or all bodies are heavy. You know, this concept of heaviness is not included or contained in the concept of bodies, whereas extension is. So that's the analytic-synthetic distinction. So for Kant, there are four kinds of propositions which express four kinds of judgments that we might be able to make about the world. There's the analytic a priori statement or proposition or judgment, where predicate concepts are contained within the subject concept, and they must be, therefore, necessarily true. There are synthetic a priori judgments, where predicate concepts are not contained in the subject, but which must be necessarily true. There are analytic a posteriori judgments, where the predicate concept is contained within the subject, and they're logically contingent, so they're not necessarily true. But then again, Kant actually rejected the possibility of such propositions. It didn't make sense to him, and indeed it doesn't make sense at all, really. If the predicate concept is contained within the subject concept, well, then those statements or those judgments are not going to be logically contingent. If I make a statement like all triangles have three sides, well, that's not logically contingent. That's just true. That's just a priori true. So that's why we can't have those kinds of statements. And then finally, there's synthetic a posteriori judgments, where the predicate concepts are not contained in the subject concept, and they are logically contingent. So Kant asked of these kinds of propositions whether we can know if they are true. That is to say, can we have synthetic a posteriori knowledge? Can we be certain about synthetic a posteriori judgments, propositions, and so forth? Let's go back to synthetic a priori judgments, which are also a big one for Kant. They tell us something about the world, right? So by virtue of that, they are synthetic. But they're also logically prior to experience, so that's why they're a priori. And these kinds of things, remember, apply to phenomena, but not to noumena, to appearances, not things in themselves. So thus Kant says, "Hereby then objects of the understanding are granted, but with the inculcation of this rule, which admits of no exception, that we neither know nor can know anything at all definite of these pure objects of understanding." So we can know about the phenomena, we cannot know about the noumena. And it's synthetic a priori judgments that help us come to know things about phenomena, about things as they appear to the knower in the world. All right, that's a lot of material. Kant, by the way, Kant is tricky. Kant thinks of a lot of this stuff in ways that many of us are simply not used to thinking about them. Space and time, reality, the mind. If you have trouble digesting this, don't worry. I remember the first time I read Kant when I was an undergraduate, and it didn't make much sense to me then. But I've really come to appreciate Kant's work, especially since I began studying cognitive science and learning more about minds, because I think it's arguably true that it turned out that Kant was right about a lot of the things he said about minds. In any case, Kant is often called the Great Synthesizer, because this whole research project that I've just described was all about making the foundations of human knowledge secure by synthesizing rationalism and empiricism. So remember, on rationalism, knowledge comes from the mind or rational principles. On empiricism, knowledge comes from the senses. And Kant synthesized that with his transcendental idealism. That is, knowledge comes from the senses, all right, but the structure of the mind is what makes the world knowable. And this is arguably something that a lot of philosophers and cognitive scientists have come to appreciate in recent years. Of course, I think this will be a topic for future videos, should I continue this channel after the present situation has resolved. But you know what? I think I will. Anyway, Kant called this project his Copernican revolution in metaphysics, right? He wanted to do what Copernicus had done for natural philosophy. Remember, Copernicus was the Polish cleric who, arguing, based upon work of some pre-Socratic philosophers, that it was the sun that was the center of the universe, not the earth, and that the earth orbited around the sun. Of course, the sun is not the center of the universe, but the earth does revolve around the sun. That's the Copernican revolution, is when scientists like Galileo and Kepler started doing work to establish that, yes, it is in fact true that the universe doesn't work the way that the church had taught that it does for centuries. Aristotle was wrong. The Earth and all the other planets go around the sun, not the other way around. Kant wanted to do something similar for metaphysics and get beyond where metaphysics had been stuck, and what he saw as the failings of both rationalism and empiricism. And for this, Kant is quite rightly regarded as incredibly important. I mean, Kant is up there with Plato and Aristotle. He is one of those giants upon whose shoulders we stand today. So Kant is very important. But Kant's philosophy has some startling implications, just like Hume's philosophy did. I mean, think about it like this. I mean, if Kant is right, we can never know what the world is really like. We can never know what reality is really, really like. We can never know things as they are in themselves. And that includes all of the things within reality. We can only know how things are as they are structured by our categories of understanding and forms of intuition and so on and so forth. So there's a bit of a similarity here. If you think about it, think back to the allegory of the cave from Plato. Plato thought we could get out of the cave and come to have at least some knowledge of the forms, which were what are really real for him. But with Kant, we're kind of stuck in the cave in a way, but we can still have some knowledge about the world. Anyway, that's just a superficial similarity. Another nice thing that I think sums Kant's work up very well is this idea that cause and effect is part of the map and not part of the territory itself. So space, time, cause and effect, all of this stuff is in the mind. It's not out there in the world. Causal laws don't exist in the world, but in the way that we perceive the world and in the way that we come to know what the world is like. Again, this is such a radical idea. And if you're not used to thinking of space and time and causality in this way, which you may not be if you haven't taken a philosophy course before, then this might seem a little bit weird. But I hope that you're able to digest this. Just, continue thinking about it if you're having trouble with it. Or talk to me in the comments section. Alright, so that's it for today. Thank you all for joining in. Thank you for bearing with me once again as I try to bring all of this material online. I know many of you are probably continuing to feel very stressed out about the present situation. I know that I certainly am. Nonetheless, I continue on. This has certainly been a challenge, but it's also been fun trying to bring these lectures to you online. And if any of you have any questions about the material, please do let me know in the comments section. If you're feeling stressed out, remember, you can always connect with me. You can connect with fellow students if you have questions about the material. Connect with your friends and family. Connect with your pets, like this. And hang in there, everybody. Really, hang in there. I mean that with all sincerity. Now, next time, I'll be lecturing on the chapter concerning truth tests. This will be the final chapter of required readings from the book. I should also have more to say about the final exam shortly. This whole situation has sort of made it difficult, to say the least, to know what to do about the final. I will say this, there will be a final exam. However, it probably won't be cumulative, or if it is, it'll just be slightly cumulative. So it'll mostly cover material from after our second term test until the end of the semester. It will probably be held via CU Learn, and I will probably limit the kinds of questions that I place on the test to multiple choice, true, false, that kind of thing. So I'm going to try to make the exam a bit less stressful, given the stress that I'm sure you're all experiencing at the moment. With that said, thanks again for tuning in. Let me know if you have any questions about the material in the comments section, or email me, or post your questions on CU Learn, and I will see you again soon with another video lecture. Take care, everybody.